Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, the two best known and most easily recognized aspects of the Vikings have to be the horned helmet, which they never actually used, and the longship, which they did indeed. These famous or infamous ships, depending on whether you were sailing in them or seeing them approaching, the Viking longships, the Draka or dragon ships as they came to be known. And of course, this is a ship of that type with the ferocious dragon or sea serpent head on the prow, perhaps representing Jormungandr, the great world serpent of Norse mythology. Shields hung along the side, the distinctive sail. They were chiefly the reason that we know about the Vikings. In fact, it could be said that they created the Vikings, because the seagoing raiders known to history collectively as the Vikings were the product of their ships. And without those amazing ships, the Vikings would never have existed. No, history would know them simply as, well, early medieval people of Scandinavia. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Frisians thrown in. No different or more interesting than most other peoples of Europe at that time. But it was their ships that set them apart and led them to become not only ferocious warriors and raiders, but also the greatest explorers, traders, settlers, and general seafarers of their age. Actually, the greatest down to the so-called Age of Discovery many centuries later. You could say, quite correctly, that the Vikings did not create their ships. Their ships created them. And they required a ship even to be called Vikings. I mean, that's something I think that often gets overlooked. To be the Vikings as we generally imagine them, ferocious, merciless raiders, pillaging, burning, and raping, a rather incorrect view of them, to be honest. Actually, a very incorrect view of them. Well, in order to be that idea of a Viking as we imagine it, a very, very special ship was required. Some slow old cargo vessel crawling along at a few knots from port to port with assorted goods and livestock, that didn't really qualify one as a proper Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse. A faster vessel was really required, able to arrive quickly and depart again even more quickly. And, that was what you needed to be a real Vikinger, not just some local trader or merchant. Of course, in reality, actually any seagoing activity qualified one for the term of Vikinger, which was just a little vague as to its exact meaning, but it's often used quite incorrectly as an interchangeable word for anyone from Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, as well as Iceland or indeed anywhere else the Old Norse settled. Used as a term of nationality, which of course it was not. It had nothing to do with anyone's country of origin. You couldn't be Vikinger, but you could go Vikinger, fara Vikinger. Because the term, which originally probably meant the resident of a coastal town, came to be used to mean something like a seafarer, a pirate, one who ventured out in a ship and did something or other when they got somewhere, wherever the ship got to. It could be seen as an adventurer, an explorer, also a long-distance trader, a settler, or a combination of all of those. But a ship was required. It was a specifically nautical term. Whatever you did, you had to do it in a ship or you weren't Vikinger. If you could go back to, well, let's say Norway in the 9th century, and you saw a man ploughing his field, and you said to him, "Are you Vikinger?" Well, he would have said, "Of course not. Do you see a ship in my field, you idiot?" And it's important to remember, of course, that nobody at that time called them Vikings. Even the Old Norse did not refer to themselves as Vikings, except in that very, very limited seafaring-related context. The Anglo-Saxons called them Dene, or Danes, as well as heathens. To the Celtic Irish, they were Dovgal, the dark foreigners, the Danes, or the Fingal, the fair foreigners, Norwegians, as well as Gentiles, while to the Franks they were the Northmen, and of course they later became the Normans. The Arabs, Slavs, and Byzantines called them the Rus, from a word meaning to row a boat, from which of course came the names of Russia and Belarus, where they settled. The term Viking was only introduced into English centuries after what we think of as Vikings had ceased to exist. Sir Walter Scott was actually one of the first to use it. And it came to mean not just seaborne raiders from Scandinavia, but anyone from anywhere where the Norse had settled, like Iceland or the Faroe Islands, and anything connected with them. There was Viking this and Viking that, things like, well, Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ships, and whatever else you can think of got the Viking prefix added to them, even though none of them actually had anything to do with the word except for a ship, and even then only in terms of those who sailed in it, not the ship itself. There was no such thing as a Viking ship, though for the sake of this video we shall call them that. And their ships were just ships in which people were going Viking. But there was no Viking music or Viking art, though there was plenty of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish music and art and so on. And while all Vikings were Norsemen, some women too, not all Norsemen were Vikings. This was not an interchangeable thing. There would have been men who never set foot in a ship, maybe never even saw one, never had left their farms or workshops, who, of course, were never Vikings. Maybe men who lived miles from the sea, and even those who did go forth as Vikings usually only did it in the summer months, when the weather at sea obviously was more suitable. Part-time Vikings, you could say, carrying on their regular trade in the off-season, carpenters, smiths, farmers, merchants, fishermen, and so on. Only a very, very few would have been nothing but raiders, earning their entire living from plunder and pillage. And we should dispel a Viking myth at this point. No, not the horned helmets they never wore, but the idea that looting, pillaging, burning, and raping anything that was female and still had a pulse, probably quite a few who didn't actually, well, that was all they did. That was the purpose of every Viking voyage. Raiding was an important aspect of the early voyages abroad. Yes, in many cases it would have been the sole reason. But as time went on, trading began to become very important, obtaining what they wanted without having to fight for it and take casualties. You see, going abroad for wealth and glory, well, that was great, but it wasn't much good if you got yourself killed in the process. You couldn't really enjoy much of the wealth and the glory after that. And they discovered that some things plentiful in their own lands, amber and fur, for example, well, they were scarce around the Mediterranean Sea and very, very highly prized, so they could trade those things easily. Slaves, of course, too, made a great profit in the slave markets of Europe and Constantinople. They began exploring and settling in the new lands, founding towns in them, well, like here in Ireland, where I live, where nearly all the major towns here were founded by the Norse settlers. Not the native Irish, even reaching North America, landing in what is now Newfoundland and going at least as far south as New Brunswick, which they named Vinland, becoming the greatest explorers and colonizers of their day. Raiding played a part, yes, but it wasn't the one and only sole thing that they did. The peoples of Scandinavia had begun using ships long before the so-called Viking Age, which is usually dated to beginning in 793 AD, with the first major Viking raid to the west, destroying the monastic settlement on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne, as it is today, in the then Kingdom of Northumbria, and ending in 1066 with the death of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Both events taking place, oddly enough, in England, the Viking Age beginning and ending far from Scandinavia. Though within that time the Viking world had existed from the Middle East to North America, right across Europe, to islands far out in the Atlantic. But the ships that gave them that ability to sail across the known world, they did not appear as if by magic in the year 793. Poof, 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 Viking ships everywhere, oh my God, they're all over the place. No, nor did they all vanish instantly in 1066. Poof, again, no more Viking ships, all gone. No, they were still around for decades after that, though taking new forms. The fearsome dragon heads, for example, began disappearing. But to start at the beginning, Bronze Age rock carvings show that boat building had been practiced in Scandinavia for centuries before becoming proper shipbuilding, and the eventual emergence of the legendary longships. Methods of construction have been improved and honed to perfection. Navigational skills had been refined. Centuries of experience had been built up. So to the question of when long-distance raiding requiring ships able to venture out across the open sea actually began. Fascinating rock carvings from the Bronze Age, long before so-called Vendel era even, that preceded the Viking Age, show what are obviously boats of some kind, with high prows and sterns, very similar in overall shape to our idea of a Viking ship, though they were more like large canoes or rafts, propelled with paddles, and probably used for short-distance coastal or river trading purposes. The first proper boat that we know about is the Hjortsbing boat, dating from the Iron Age circa 400 BC. Very, very similar in appearance to the Bronze Age rock carvings, some 62 feet long, and seems to have had a crew of around 20, being propelled using paddles rather than oars. The first of what could really be considered a proto-longship is the Nydam boat, one of the oldest boats that was rowed rather than paddled. 75 feet long and 11 feet wide, made of oak, with 14 pairs of oars and raised at both ends, made in Denmark circa 350 AD, but not strong enough to have carried a mast. And sails don't ever seem to have been used until the 8th century, when ships were built with strong enough frames to support the weight of the mast and the sail. A long sea voyage, just using oars, would have been difficult, to say the least, trying to compete against the waves and currents at sea just with your oars. And these early vessels, they would have hugged the coastline, keeping close inshore, of course ready to run into harbour or a sheltered cove at the first sign of an approaching storm. Around 700 AD, the first proper keel was devised, which is the base of a ship on which everything else rests. Found in the Kvalsund ship, a vessel large and strong enough to use a sail and to carry passengers and crew out to sea, 60 feet long and 10 feet wide. Techniques found in these early vessels were refined and carried over into what we call the Viking Age, which culminated by the end of the century in the awesome longships as we know them. In other words, these. Perhaps the finest vessels ever made for their intended purpose, seeming to glide over the top of the sea rather than ploughing through the waves, and having a very shallow draft of only 3 feet, enabling them to sail up shallow rivers. Perhaps ships that would carry these Norse people across most of the known world, from the Middle East to North America and everywhere in between. These amazing new ships expanding the ability to reach other lands that lay far out to the west across the open sea. And raiding, of course, began on a scale that was hitherto impossible, as of course did long-distance trading and settlement. All of those things grew from these amazing ships. At least that is what we supposed. But that may not be totally correct. Not the use of the ships, no, but the actual start of the Viking Age may have been as much as a century earlier than we previously thought, and a vessel similar to the Kvalsund ship rather than the later classic longship may have actually begun it. In 2008, workmen laying electrical cables on the Estonian island of Saaremaa in the Baltic Sea came across bones and various small objects, which they assumed probably belonged to soldiers from World War II, took no notice of them, and cleared them out of the way. But when an archaeologist came to identify the remains, she spotted they were clearly not anything as recent as the Second World War. They weren't still chucking spears at one another during the Second World War. And further investigation discovered the remains of a ship, 38 feet long, though almost all of the timbers had long since rotting away, leaving little more than an impression. But there were hundreds of iron rivets that had held the craft together. They had fallen in place, and between the two they were able to trace the outline of the ship perfectly. It was clearly not just some little fishing vessel or local trading craft. It was narrow, lightly made of clinker construction, where wooden planks are overlaid, working upwards, each row of planks fastened to the top of the planks below and riveted together. And it would have been very fast and well able to navigate out to sea far from the safety of the coastline, since it's over 150 miles to Saaremaa Island from mainland Sweden, where it was thought the ship had originated. And even had it travelled from Gotland rather than from the mainland of Sweden, it would still have had a voyage of something over 100 miles across open sea. And the Baltic is prone to storms and very heavy seas. Carbon dating established it had been constructed in the first decades of the 8th century, from 700 to 750 AD, at least 40 and as much as 100 years before the first credited Viking raid took place, placing it well back into the pre-Viking Age known as the Vendel period. Presumably it would have been driven by oars. There was no indication of a sail, though it's possible there was one and it had just rotted away. And remarkably, its crew was still on board, 7 men, their ages ranging from 18 to approximately 45. Examination of the teeth, plus the style of artifacts discovered, seemed to indicate that the men had come from central Sweden. Now, this was not a burial ship, as such, like the famous Oseberg ship, which had been the tomb of an obviously very important woman. No, the men found on board this vessel had not been ceremonially buried with the ship. Some lay against the side of the hull in a sitting position, others lay together or in pairs haphazardly around the ship, probably killed there and left pretty much where they fell. But 2 years later, things got even more interesting, when a second and much larger ship was discovered only 100 feet away, clearly a related vessel. There had been 2 ships sailing together, and both crews had died somehow and been left with their ships. The small ship was dubbed Salme 1, and the larger one Salme 2. Now, Salme 1 was a remarkable find in itself, a ship discovered with its crew still on board, but Salme 2 was even more exciting, a considerably larger vessel. Tracing the outline left by the iron rivets showed it to have been 55 feet long by 10 feet wide. Like the Karlsson ship, it had a proper keel, and a large amount of iron, wood debris, and the remains of cloth found at the center of the ship indicated that it did have a mast and a sail. That would make it the oldest Scandinavian ship ever found that was propelled by sail as well as oars, which could explain the smaller vessel being oar-driven but still sea-going, sailing as it was with the larger, more powerful vessel, perhaps even being towed by it if seas were rough. Like Salme 1, the crew was still on board. 33 men, and big, powerful men too. Some would have been over 6 feet tall, which would have made them very formidable warriors in an age when the average height of men was around 5 foot 10 inches. A number of them had obvious injuries to their bones that had healed, indicating they had been in previous combat. And there were injuries that had probably killed them. One man had the top of his skull sliced completely off by what appeared to be a sword cut. Another had his arm severed. And there were arrowheads found among the bodies, which had probably been embedded in them and fell out as the bodies decayed. And unlike Salme 1, these men had been laid out at one end of the ship in what was clearly an organized manner, not just dumped willy-nilly, with their weapons and their belongings placed around them, their bodies covered with their shields. The wood of the shields, of course, was long since rotted away, but the bronze shield bosses were still in place on the bodies, as well as some of the grips. And bits of material found among them could have been part of the sail that had been draped across them as a covering. Numerous artifacts were recovered, including a large number of swords, spear and arrowheads, a bear claw necklace, knives, gaming pieces made from deer antlers or whalebone, as well as 2 ritually sacrificed dogs and hawks, the latter probably having been used for falconry. There were also indications that suggested the placement of the bodies was related to their social status, with the lower classes on the bottom and the upper class on top, as of course they should be. Oh, God, yes. Those at the bottom having, fairly ordinary single-edged swords without any great ornamentation, while the 5 men whose bodies were above them had double-edged swords with expensive and elaborately decorated bronze grips, guards, and pommels, suggesting that these were nobles. Well, certainly men of some importance. Given that the men on Salme 1 were seemingly ordinary in status and had been left scattered about, nobody really bothered with them, while those on Salme 2 had been very carefully arranged and clearly indicated prominent and important men, it has been suggested that one ship carried perhaps a Jarl and his bodyguards. It was the flagship, if you like, while the other one carried less important persons, servants and retainers, and may have been a transport or a supply vessel accompanying the larger and more important ship. But that still left the question: what had caused the two ships to be beached, I should say, with their dead crews left on board, and who had arranged the bodies? Surviving crew members or a victorious enemy showing care and respect to the crew of one ship while leaving the crew of the other ship where they fell? But this is a very interesting question. Obviously, the dead bodies didn't arrange themselves. Arrowheads were discovered lying along the ship's outline, indicating they had been fired into the hull and had dropped out when the ship rotted. Was this a raid gone horribly wrong, or a peaceful trading voyage that didn't impress those they were trying to trade with? Well, we really don't know. I mean, there's not any way to actually discover that. Raiders would hardly be intending to stop for a bit of falconry, it was suggested, so why did they bring the hawks, or dogs for that matter? And the suggestion was that they had been on a peaceful voyage, possibly a diplomatic mission of some kind. The fact that somebody had shot the ship full of arrows, to say nothing of cutting off bits of the crew's bodies, would seem to suggest a very unsuccessful bit of diplomacy. I think the peaceful voyage idea totally fails to answer several important questions. I mean, why were the ships fired on? Why were so many of the crew killed? Why were the ships abandoned with all those bodies on board if they had not been on a warlike mission? Of course, the arrows could have dated from some previous hostile encounter, and perhaps the crew had simply snapped off the shaft, intending to dig out the arrowheads at a later date. But that still does not explain the dead crew. Unless they overdid the partying with the local Estonians. Some of them got killed in a drunken brawl, the rest drank themselves to death, and the Estonians were kind enough to put them into their ships, which seems a bit hard to believe. Or it could have been both warlike and trading. They traded where that was possible and easy, and raided where it wasn't. But the manner in which one crew, the important noble one, was laid out shows that there must have been some ceremony involved by those who tended to the bodies. They didn't just pile them up and go. No, they performed some kind of funeral rites, whatever those may have been, and that does strongly suggest that it was fellow Swedes who were responsible. Even if they were paying some respect to fallen warriors, it seems highly unlikely that the Estonians would have gone as far as that. I mean, why would they? Or was there perhaps a third ship, and it was the crew of that ship that had laid out the important bodies before departing? Who knows? But what if it wasn't a raiding party? If it was just a peaceful voyage that ended up very peacefully, would that alter its status as a Viking expedition, and any change in the date of the Viking Age as a result? Well, no. No, it wouldn't. To be Vikinger, one had to go somewhere in a ship, and clearly the men on board these two ships had done just that. And there was no specific requirement to raid, pillage, and burn things when they got wherever they were going. The going off in the ship itself, that was quite enough. So a trading or diplomatic mission would still make them Vikinger, even if all they did when they got to Estonia was drink mead, exchange gifts, and look for a woman for the night. So whatever the purpose of the men in those two ships was, and that is something we shall never know, of course, with absolute certainty, they had crossed the sea, they had gone somewhere in a ship, and thus they were Vikings. Not just Swedes out for a nice little boat trip. So, should the Viking Age be dated as beginning considerably earlier, to 750 AD, which the British Museum does suggest due to these two ships having been found, or even back to 700 AD when this type of ship seems to have originated, or simply credit the Vendel era with the first Viking raids outside Scandinavia? Of course, given the Old Norse predilection for, shall we say, forcibly borrowing things from people who had stuff that they desired, they might well have raided one place while on a peaceful mission to somewhere else. That is entirely possible, and been killed on the way back, having completed their diplomatic mission or trading or whatever else they may have been doing, saw what seemed to be an easy target as they passed by. Oh, look, that looks plain, that looks undefended, and attempted a eventually rather unsuccessful raid on the return voyage. That certainly is entirely possible. But to move on to the end of the 8th century and Lindisfarne, the Viking Age had begun. The famed Drakar or dragon ship had arrived, regardless of when it originated, and things would never be the same again. Now, these ships could be owned by an individual, a king or a jarl, a wealthy local nobleman in the case of the warships, or wealthy merchants or traders in the case of the cargo ships. And we shall be looking in detail at cargo ships as well, since the dragon-headed warships were not the only Norse vessels. Ships could, of course, also be owned by a town or a village collectively rather than an individual, being quite expensive to make, the ship being used for the prosperity of the entire community. In time of war, the king or the jarl could commission them, using them for transport or supply purposes, augmenting their own warships, thus saving having to maintain a large standing navy comprising warships and merchant cargo vessels. The longship's participation in war, however, was largely in a troop transporting role rather than as actual warships engaging in combat, as had the Greek and Roman war galleys, or the great battleships of the 18th and 19th centuries firing broadsides at one another. When the Viking ships did engage in actual combat, they were usually either employed to board enemy ships, or they would be tied together and they would form a sort of floating battle platform for the warriors to fight on, with perhaps a couple of free ships to harass the enemy or sail around behind them. And they would form a battle that was really land warfare conducted at sea, the tied together ships being a substitute for the land. And not really a naval battle as such, as we understand naval battles later on, where ships would circle around firing things at each other or trying to ram. But the new ships were able to expand military operations considerably, often over long distances. Large fleets of ships carrying great numbers of warriors on what were more than just little coastal raids, such as when the crumbling Frankish Empire was attacked in the 9th century, when in 820 AD a fleet of Viking ships sailed up the Seine and other rivers, others invading Flanders at the same time. In 845 AD, hundreds of ships attacked Paris, only leaving after the citizens paid them £7,000 of silver to go away. And in the same year, a large Danish fleet attacked the fortified city of Hamburg. Later, King Canute the Great was said to have had over 1,000 ships when he sailed to Norway in 1028. By the end of the 8th century, the stage was set for the great raid on Lindisfarne to be repeated time and time again all across Europe, but also for the trading, the settling, and eventual colonization and integration that would follow. In part 2, we shall continue our look at the one thing that created the Vikings, without which history would never have heard of them: their ships. So, farewell until next time. Goodbye for now.